following is a Galactic Digital Studios production. This is Sports Central, part of the Closing Tag Network. Well, Clippers fans, the day that you have dreaded for so long has arrived. This is Sports Central, a very special edition of Sports Central, part of the Closing Tag Network. Now, as I mentioned in the last episode, this is going to be a solely Clippers-focused episode of Sports Central. We're not going to dive into any further, free agency goings-on in the NBA. We're not going to do any coverage of who may have been missing OTAs in the NFL. We're not going to cover Major League Baseball. We're not going to cover Major League Soccer. Go Raul. We're not going to be doing any of that today. No hockey talk, none of that nonsense. No talk about Caitlin Clark, none of that. We are focusing solely on the Los Angeles Clippers. I want to do a little bit of a history lesson for everybody. Because as a wise man once told me, those who fail to learn from history are doomed to repeat it. I want to rewind the clock back, all the way back 40 years to 1984. The San Diego Clippers, as they were known at the time, because they were in San Diego, what's a really good way to put this? They were terrible. The San Diego Clippers were absolutely god-awful, and you can point the finger and point the blame at any number of things. You can basically bring up the Bill Walton curse, may he rest in peace. But it dates even further back than their days in Los Angeles. Essentially, it dates all the way back to the beginning of the franchise back in 1970, when they were known as the Buffalo Braves. Aside from that string of 3 years where Bob McAdoo and Jack Ramsey were leading the Buffalo Braves to the conference semifinals every year, 42, 49, 46 wins. Aside from that little stretch, it took the Clippers organization, just doing some rudimentary math here, 21 years just to make the playoffs. And that's between the Buffalo Braves, the San Diego Clippers, and the Los Angeles Clippers. Now, it wasn't a matter of, they won 40 games and they may or may not have actually, made the playoffs if they were in an actually decent, competitive conference or whatever. Nothing like that. They were consistently bringing 20-win seasons. 22, 21, 21. That 3-year period that we talked about. 30, 27. Okay, there is a 43 in there when they first moved to San Diego, but whatever. 35, 36. 17. 25, 30, 31, 32. 12. I believe that was the year that they could have selected Purvis Ellison in the first round of the draft. 17, 21, 20, 31. And it wasn't until 1992 at the leadership of both Coach Larry Brown and All-Star Danny Manning that the Clippers actually made the playoffs with 45 wins. The next season, they still had Larry Brown as the head coach. They still had Danny Manning as their top player. And they made the playoffs again. The next year after that, they traded Danny Manning for Dominique Wilkins. And they fired Larry Brown. And it was right back to that perpetual cycle of suck, as I like to call it. 27 wins, 17 wins, 29 wins. They finally made it back to the playoffs in 1997 as the 8th seed with 36 wins and 46 losses. So they were still an under 500 team, but they at least made the playoffs and lost in the first round 3-0 to the Utah Jazz, who in that season were basically running roughshod and getting ready to make their first NBA Finals. And then after that, it was back to the perpetual cycle of suck. 17 wins, 9 wins in the lockout shortened season, which would have likely been good enough to be considered one of the worst records in NBA history. 15 wins, 31 wins, 39 wins, 27, 28, 37. They finally made it back to the playoffs in 2006 with Mike Dunleavy as the coach and Elton Brand as their top guy. And they actually made it to the semifinals. Lost to Phoenix in the second round, but they at least made it past the first round this time. For the first time in franchise history since the days of Buffalo. 40 wins, 23, 19, 29, 32. Then a funny thing happened. The Clippers traded for Chris Paul. Now, kind of bringing some old wounds back up for Lakers fans, and I apologize. Not really, but we'll say that I do. The Lakers had an agreement in place with the at the time New Orleans Hornets. And they were getting ready to make the trade for Chris Paul. David Stern, the commissioner of the NBA, who had just purchased the Hornets from, I can't remember the guy's name. He's the same guy that used to own the Saints. May he rot in hell. David Stern bought the team from him. And as the new owner of the New Orleans Hornets, vetoed the trade and instead traded Chris Paul to the Clippers. Now, I don't have all the specifics in front of me, but consider that for a minute. Chris Paul and Kobe Bryant in the same backcourt. That would have been a problem. That would have been a big problem. But at least Chris Paul wouldn't have had to go until 2025 potentially to win his first NBA championship. But since making the trade for Chris Paul, they have been consistently making the playoffs. Up until, there was a couple of exceptions. They missed the playoffs in 2022. That was because most of their players were injured for most of the season, coming off, the COVID season, as they like to call it. And they also missed the playoffs in 2018. Now, I believe injuries were a factor in that as well, but that might have also been, I think that was the year that Phoenix barely missed the playoffs, and that was what started this whole thing about, the play-in tournament and this, that, and the other. So from 2011, the time that they traded for Chris Paul, all the way until just recently, the Clippers have been consistently winning 40-plus games and making the playoffs. that's about to end. Because in case you didn't listen the last time that I mentioned it on the last episode of Sports Central, part of the Closing Tag Network, we really need to work on that tagline. Paul George signed with the Philadelphia 76ers on a max contract, and the Clippers in return got a grand total of 0. They basically let their best player, I don't care what you say about Kawhi Leonard. Yes, when healthy, Kawhi Leonard is one of the best players in the league. The problem is, for the last 5 years, he hasn't been healthy. He hasn't been healthy since he led the Toronto Raptors to an NBA championship. So, basically, they let their best player go for nothing. Nothing. Which is exactly what I thought they should have done. Just start over from scratch. Now, when I made that suggestion, both on the podcast and in the blogs on sports.theclosingtag.com, when I made that suggestion, I suggested that they basically clean house of all the old veterans, aside from Kawhi, because you're not going to be able to trade Kawhi. Not right now. But let George walk. Let Russell Wilson walk or trade him. Let James Harden walk. Instead, the Clippers not only didn't let James Harden walk, they signed him to a new 2-year deal worth $70 million. That's 70. $70 million for a guy that is clearly past his prime. And you can come at me all you want. Oh, you're just a James Harden hater. You've never liked James Harden. Part of that is true. I've never been a James Harden guy. But I've especially not been a James Harden guy over the last 2 years. Ever since he essentially quit on the Nets. And then it did the same thing with the 76ers. And I almost guarantee you he is going to do the exact same thing to the Clippers. And then you're going to have a major problem on your hands because you can't trade him because he's making $35 million a year. Nobody's going to want to pay that much for the guy other than the Clippers. And then on top of that, you've got Westbrook, who you can't trade. So now you're stuck with 3 aging, over-the-hill, past their prime veterans. Only one of whom has actually accomplished something in his life and in his career other than accumulating stats. And I'm sorry that Westbrook stands and Harden stands don't like hearing that. And you can email all your hate mail to Raul at theclosingtag.com all you want. But the facts are the facts. Russell Westbrook and James Harden have contributed a grand total of fuck all for playoff success. They both went to the NBA Finals once. Back in 2012. And guess who is the main guy there in Oklahoma City? It wasn't Westbrook, and it damn sure wasn't Harden. And by the way, he is old and over the hill and past his prime too. So you've got these two guys that work best as secondary, players, secondary characters for, a championship contender team, except they're not secondary guys behind a guy that's all that reliable. Kawhi Leonard, for all the good that he's accomplished in San Antonio and in Toronto, has also contributed a grand total of fuck all for the Clippers. And the fact of the matter is that he is no longer that guy that was in Toronto. Yeah, hell, he's no longer the guy that was there before the bubble. Kawhi Leonard, or at least the Kawhi Leonard that we know and love, is dead and buried somewhere either in San Antonio or Toronto. Kawhi Leonard is no longer a reliable number one for a championship team. James Harden and Russell Westbrook were never going to be reliable number ones on a championship team. Now, you're probably saying to me through YouTube, well, that's fine, Raul. That's perfectly fine. We'll just trade for somebody. With what? With what? You have nobody that any other team wants other than Kawhi Leonard, and even his contract's a little cuckoo for Cocoa Puffs for anybody to take on. You have no draft control to speak of until well past 2030. And the NBA collective bargaining agreement won't even allow you to trade those picks. You have no one on your team that could potentially bring a superstar player in that could help lighten the load. You pushed all your chips into the table, or into the middle of the table. You went all in on winning a championship in 2024. Not 25, not 26, not 27, 24. And you failed miserably. And now it is about to bite the Clippers in the ass. The best thing would have done that they could have done is start over from scratch. But instead they chose a half measure. Instead of going full in on rebuilding around Kawhi Leonard, they went with a half measure, which is exactly what I've been trying to preach for months now that they shouldn't be doing. Instead of signing James Harden to a more friendly contract that could potentially give them more flexibility to maybe bring in a DeMar DeRozan, or maybe bring in someone, or maybe even trade for a Karl Anthony Towns with help from a third team. Instead, they sign him to a deal that is now untradeable. They sign him to a contract that is virtually untradeable. They have locked themselves in to 2 more years of this nonsense. That's on them. That's not on Kawhi. That's not on Harden. I mean, If someone offered me $70 million to go play mediocre basketball for 2 years, I'd sign that deal too. I don't fault him at all. I'll fault him when he quits on the team eventually, but I don't fault him right now. Why? Because he took the money? Honestly, any of you that are watching this right now, if someone offered you $70 million to do your job half-ass, would you take it? I'd bet you would. I would be willing to bet you would. I don't fault him for taking the money. I fault the Clippers for giving it to him. As fireworks are right now going off in the background. James Harden and Russell Westbrook are going to bring the Clippers back to pre-Lob City levels. It is going to be a very nasty, very ugly transition. But again, it's because, just like it was before with the Danny Manning era and the Elton Brand era and the Bill Walton era and all these eras that came before Lob City, the only difference is that you no longer have an executive in the front office that we know of that's basically saying on draft day, wait, the draft is today? Huh? Wait, I was not made aware of this. At least now, executives are smart enough to carry their phones around with them, and their phones have alerts basically and letting them know, hey, oh, by the way, dingus, today's the draft. Of course, granted, the Clippers don't really have any draft picks to speak of, but we'll leave that alone. So, where do the Clippers go from here? Unfortunately, down. That's the only direction they can go. You're not going to compete with the Dallases and the Denvers and the Minnesotas and the Oklahoma Cities or the Sacramentos or the Lakers or the Golden State Warriors. Hell, I don't think you're even going to be able to compete against the Houston Rockets. Have you seen that team lately? That's a dark horse sleeper right there. Clip that. Save that. Come back to me in about 8 or 9 months. Yeah? Cool. The Clippers are going to be about the same level as the Utah Jazz. Granted, the Jazz are probably going to tank more because they actually have draft picks to tank for. Oh, and by the way, Memphis is on its way back up too, so you're not going to be able to compete there either. So at the rate things are going, the Clippers may not even make the play-in. So what was the point of all this? Oh, and by the way, Chris Paul, that same Chris Paul that we talked about, that was going to be a problem if he had gotten traded to the Lakers and eventually turned the entire Clippers organization around. He has now signed a 1-year deal with the San Antonio Spurs. I forgot to mention that in the last episode. I apologize. Chris Paul and Victor Wembanyama on the same team. God help us all. So the Clippers only have down to go from here. You're not going to go into another 7-game series in the first round. You're not going to actually make the playoffs this year outright. You're done. The nice little bubble of actual relevance and actually being compared on the same level as Big Brother in LA is over. And there's no one to blame for that but Clippers management. The same people, relatively, names and faces change, but the same people that brought decades of irrelevance and misery and fans showing up at the arenas with paper bags over their heads. Yes, that is a thing that happened. The Clippers started that. All those years were caused by management. And all the coming years of misery and irrelevance and people showing up at that nice shiny new stadium with the nice shiny new logo with paper bags over their heads will have been caused by management as well. Those who fail to learn from history are doomed to repeat it. If you'd like to donate, donation link is in the upper right hand corner of theclosingtag.com, any of the closing tag sites. If you want to leave a review on Spotify, reviews are open. If you are watching this on Facebook, like the video, share with friends and family, comment. If you are watching this on YouTube, like the video, subscribe to the channel, and hit the bell for notifications. That way, you are notified anytime a new video drops. I may be dialing it back a little bit on these Sports Central episodes just for a little while. Aside from the fact that we're in the dog days of summer at this point. There's some personal stuff that's going on in my life that may prevent me from recording podcasts, at least for a while. Not to be alarmed, I'm not going to die. I'm not going to jail or anything like that. It's just some stuff I need to take care of. Yeah. But thank you, everyone, for listening, for liking, for downloading, for donating, for doing everything you can to help support the podcast. Your efforts are not going unnoticed. So thank you. And until next time, sorry, Clippers fans. And remember to include your closing tags. Thanks. This has been a Galactic Digital Studios production.